Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about Great Expectations, the novel by Charles Dickens. And I hope that I can meet some of your great expectations by doing this classic chestnut some justice. But Dickens is going, no! Right? This is going to be an entire summary of this novel. This isn't going to be a little 3-minute or 8-minute synopsis. And so sit back, get your hot chocolate and get comfortable, and let's dive into some Dickens. I scored this annotated Dickens at the Goodwill outlet bins for a whole 50 cents, guys. And annotated means it's got everything and a bag of chips, and so you're getting the whole full summary today. And if when you get tired of it, you can just use it as a weight. You could get your exercise, because I'm going to tell you, this bad boy, he's heavy. Great Expectations was Charles Dickens's 13th novel, and it was published in serials. It was published in a magazine, 2 chapters every week. So the people were literally pressed, waiting, biting their nails, waiting for the next issue to come out. And in the meanwhile, they would read it more than once. They would talk about it with their friends while they played cards, and it was a very, very popular novel at that time. After the serialization was over, it was later also combined into a book. In Great Expectations, we're treated to Dickens' best droll English humor. And they say sometimes Americans cannot understand British humor. Well, let me tell you, you can understand Dickens, and it is hilarious. He has a way of turning a phrase. He has a way of showing what a character is doing in such a funny manner that you just can't stop from laughing out loud. Pip is the main character. He's an orphan. He's the hero protagonist. And basically he is looking the entire novel to raise his status, his station in the world, and he aspires to be a gentleman. It's mentioned in the annotated Dickens that Dickens also kind of always hit on certain topics like class issues, hankering for money, and actually the love of a woman. So I believe that Pip actually hit close to Dickens' own heart with these issues that he brought forth in his novel. Pip's tortured love for a girl named Estella drives the entire novel. His love is illogical, it's unrequited, and it's really foolish. But as love is, he loves foolishly, but no matter, he keeps on loving her. In the novel, everyone has great expectations, not just Pip, of wealth, of property, of social standing, and they have to deal with how those great expectations square up with reality. Dickens was pressured to change his ending. He had originally intended for the ending not to be so happy, but he bowed for the pressure, and he did resolve this in a happier ending. So without further ado, let's just get into the entire summary. To begin, the novel opens in rather a gothic way with little orphan Pip in a cemetery looking at the grave of his parents, and he comes across an escaped convict who we later learn is named Magwitch, so we'll just call him Magwitch now. And Magwitch is looking for some food, and he's got a leg iron on, and he's looking for some kind of tool to get the leg iron off of him. And he both scares Pip, and Pip does feel pity for the escaped convict. Pip then tells us that he is being brought up by his sister, who is 20 years his senior, named Mrs. Joe Gargery, and also her husband, Mr. Joe Gargery. And so he just calls him Joe, or Mr. Joe, and her Mrs. Joe. And we're told that Pip is brought up by hand, which back in that time kind of meant bottle-fed and or being pampered. But then he is quickly to disabuse us of that notion, because by hand sort of means corporal punishment. And she has a cane that she uses on him that she calls the tickler. She's pretty abusive. She's also abusive to her husband. And this is where Dickens starts right out of the gate with the humor. Pip suggests her husband Joe was forced also by hand to marry her because she was so ugly, and that she probably beat him into submission, which it's funny the way it's phrased in the novel. So Dickens shows his humor even with his sister coming to spank Pip and Joe warning Pip off with, "She's on a rampage and she's a-coming." And it is just funny, even the way it's written out. You know it's not good that he's getting caned, but the way Dickens puts it is kind of funny. So we're told that the prisoner has escaped from what's called a hulk, which is a big prison ship that's stationed quite a distance off the shore. And Pip decides that he's going to take his bread that he would be eating, his daily portion of bread, and he's also going to go into the pantry and steal a pie and then go to the forge and steal a file and bring it back to the escaped convict. He just feels pity for the convict, and he feels a little bit of fear. In the fog, making his way back to the convict to give him the goods, Pip does see another convict, and then he starts to wonder if it's true that the convict isn't alone. And so that ramps up the fear that he has about the convict, that, not only is it one person that he's helping, that it's maybe two, and it makes him even a little more scared. By chapter 4, Dickens decides to let us know that it's actually Christmas time. So with all this kind of gothic stuff going on with mists and fogs and convicts and leg irons and stealing the food, he finally gets around to letting us know that it's actually Christmas time. And again, Dickens displays his droll humor when he talks about Mrs. Joe's cleaning habits in anticipation of having guests over for dinner. He writes, "Mrs. Joe was a very clean housekeeper, but had an exquisite art of making her cleanliness more uncomfortable than the dirt itself." So he even turns Mrs. Joe's OCD tendencies into quite a little chuckle. Oh, Pip also tells us that Mrs. Joe went to church vicariously, which means she sent everybody else to church and felt that that was good enough for her. And then after they all came back from church, they sat down for a Christmas dinner. We're also shown Pip's deep love for Mr. Joe. At this point, Mr. Joe is his real friend and shows him true love. He does fail to tell Mr. Joe that he has stolen from the pantry and he has stolen from the forge in order to help this escaped convict. Pip pretty much tells the reader, looking back in retrospect, that he views himself at this point in life as being a coward. Pip continuously in the novel struggles with cowardice and both with guilt. I just get another little chuckle out of the part where Mr. Joe tells Pip to forgive Mrs. Joe her shortcomings because he thinks she's just a mastermind. Mr. Joe thinks Mrs. Joe is a mastermind. He kind of thinks she's like a boss biatch, and then he just thinks that Pip should just kind of try to forgive her shortcomings, which would be her temper and her corporal punishment of him. So one day, Mrs. Joe comes home and tells Pip and Mr. Joe that Mrs. Haversham wants Pip to come to her residence to play. And everybody had known in the town by word of mouth about this Miss Haversham, that she was reclusive, that she was grim, that she was kind of strange, but no one had ever slapped eyes on her. So Mrs. Joe proceeds to give Pip what I call a pageant scrub. He is scrubbed like a new potato, he is put in his best attire, and he is taken by Mr. Pumblechook over to the Haversham residence. At Miss Haversham's, a pretty girl named Estella comes out, and we are left to deduce in retrospect that Pip is about age 7 at this point, and that Estella is perhaps also about age 7. Perhaps she's aged a little bit older than him, but regardless, Estella insists on calling him boy. She then tells Pip that the name of the house is called Sadis, or Sadis House, as in sated, as in satisfied, but oh, the irony, no one at that house is satisfied. So Estella leads Pip into a room that's lit only by candles, and it's a real dark room, and he sees what he thinks is a woman all in white with white hair, and the closer he looks and the more his eyes adjust, he sees what it looks like, almost like a yellowing skeleton. This lady was once curvy and is just wizened down, and it's Miss Haversham. Miss Haversham pretty much then tells Pip that she's brokenhearted, that she hasn't seen the sun since he was born, and then she pretty much commands him to play. So Pip is commanded to play cards with Estella, and they do. And Estella just takes it upon herself to call Pip common to his face pretty much. And she makes fun of his hands, she makes fun of his shoes. And Miss Haversham whispers, "Oh, you can break his heart." So she's pretty sadistic. At this point, I think Dickens is really hitting the imagery of the light and the dark shades of this novel. Inside Satis' house, everything is dark. It's lit by candles. Estella's name is, Estella means star. This novel was written during the height of the Gothic revival in Europe. And so the idea of fog and cobwebs and beetles and spiders and things falling into disrepair were very popular with the culture, with the people. And so it's not unheard of for Dickens to be using this device in his novels. So after they play, Miss Havisham proceeds to tell Pip to return in 6 days, and Estella goes and she gives Pip some food out in the courtyard, and she feeds him with so much contempt that Pip compares it to even how he fed the convict. He was just a gentleman in feeding the convict compared to how Estella treats Pip. And Pip, he is just devastated, and he goes off and he almost cries in front of her, and she takes great delight in him almost crying, like she loves it. And he goes off and just kicks the walls and hits the walls and gets very upset and cries his heart out. But meanwhile, back at the forge, Pip and Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe and everybody's sitting around, and they want to know about all the grand doings over at the Havisham estate, and Pip just basically lies to them. He just makes up fanciful stories because he can't bear to tell them the truth. And so they began to plant these seeds of great expectations of what Mrs. Havisham can do for Pip. And they get it into Pip's mind that this is a turning point in his life. Pip does finally confide to Joe at the forge about the strangeness at the Havisham residence. And Joe pretty much tells him to knock off the lying, to live well, and to die happy. And if you had to distill everything into the moral of the story, this is it. Joe is the moral compass of the story. The visit to Satis' house has just deeply affected Pip. He looks around his environment now, at the forge, at its inhabitants, at his clothes, at his situation, and he is just deeply dissatisfied. It's really rather sad. It really is. It's like a child's first venturing outside the confines of a comfortable home, albeit poor, to see how the other half live, even though this really isn't truly the other half. It's a strange situation. But then he's comparing his situation, assuming the grass is greener. He's just deeply, deeply dissatisfied now with his station in life. As scheduled, 6 days later, Pip goes back to Mrs. Havisham's, and he's led into a room by Estella with all these people, and he's literally just told to look outside a window as they all talk. And we're later told that this is Mrs. Havisham's relations and that they've come over because it's her birthday, but she's giving them pretty much no attention. So at this point, we're shown the wedding feast room, which is basically a big dining hall that's got a table that's covered with all the cutlery and the cakes and stuff, as if a bride was going to be celebrating her wedding. 20 years have gone by, 15 years have gone by. You've got cobwebs, you've got bugs, fungus, just all kinds of dust and nastiness. And Mrs. Havisham enjoys showing Pip every little detail of this room, and pretty much proceeds to tell Pip in a rather macabre way that she's one day going to be laid out on this table and all her nasty relations are going to be sitting there looking at her. Meanwhile, Estella's baiting Pip the whole time, asking him, "Oh, am I pretty? Am I insulting you yet?" And she just tries to entice him and then also upset him. And then he tells her he's basically not going to cry over her anymore, which he doesn't mean at all. We're pretty much shown that Miss Havisham is a holder of grudges, that she's stuck in the past. She's sitting there wearing the same wedding dress for a decade. So everything's stuck in time, and she's not gone outside, and nothing has been cleaned, and she's pretty much just raising Estella and raising her to be manipulative. Pip is fed again like a dog in the courtyard, and he's rather ill-treated, but Estella's pretty and she plays with him. She even allows Pip to give her a little kiss, and then she acts like it's nothing. So it's really like a push and pull over at the Satis house, and Pip just feels like maybe unequal to the challenge. So this strange ritual of going over to this funky house, it continues for many months, and they become accustomed to Pip, and he becomes accustomed to playing cards with Estella and falls more and more in love with her. And finally, Mrs. Havisham asks that Mr. Joe Gargery come and see her because she is going to pay for him to apprentice Pip at the forge. A few years go by, and Pip is learning the art of blacksmithing from Joe, along with another man named Orlick at the forge. One day he decides to pay a visit on Miss Havisham, and when he comes home, he finds the whole town at his house because someone's attacked Mrs. Joe Gargery, and she is severely wounded. A peer of his named Biddy, a girl of about the same age as Pip, ends up coming to stay at the Gargery residence in order to help Mrs. Joe because she's like no longer able to talk. They weren't sure who had attacked Mrs. Joe, as nothing had been stolen from the forge. It turns out the weapon that was used to strike Mrs. Joe was a convict's leg iron. So it was suspected that maybe a stranger had come along and attacked Mrs. Joe, or that maybe even it was Orlick because he had had a previous fight with Mrs. Joe. But no one thought Mr. Joe did it because he had been at the pub. Pip was cowardly here too because he saw it was a convict's leg iron that had attacked Mrs. Joe, but he still failed to tell Mr. Joe that he had helped a convict escape. So at this point in the novel, Pip is only going to the sadist's house annually, pretty much say hi to Mrs. Havisham and to kind of get the update on Estella, who is away at school. And she just gives him a guinea, and he spends that money on his education because he still wants to become a gentleman to interest Estella. He also confides in Biddy, who is now at the Gargery residence, about wanting to become a gentleman. But Biddy disagrees with him. She wants to know if he wants to become a gentleman to spite Estella or to win Estella over. And Pip really doesn't know how to answer that question. So a lawyer named Jagger comes up on the scene. I think it's funny that Jagger is also a word for knife, but anyway. A lawyer named Jagger shows up on the scene and tells Pip he has an unusual business transaction for him, dealing with him, and that he is expected to be a great gentleman, that he has great expectations of getting a handsome property and being brought up as a gentleman, but the hitch is that at this point he cannot know who his benefactor is. Sounds like a fairy tale, right? Right?
For the last time, no.
Exactly. So Pip goes off to London to learn how to be a gentleman, and Jagger is the guardian who's paying for this expedition. So Pip heads off to London to learn how to be a gentleman, and he meets the Pocket family. Matthew Pocket's the brother of Mrs. Havisham, and the nephew of Mrs. Havisham is Herbert Pocket, who ends up being Pip's best friend. And here, Herbert Pocket is able to give Pip the backstory on the crazy Havisham history. And the backstory is that a handsome, showy man had shown up in town and wooed Mrs. Havisham. He had asked her to be his wife. She had given him a lot of money, and that he ended up jilting her at the altar. She had been warned against him, but she was haughty and would not hear a word against her bridegroom. And on the wedding day at 20 minutes to 9, he simply just did not show up. He jilted her, and during her act of dressing, she was given a letter, and no one ever saw what the letter contained, but obviously it was like a Dear Jane letter. And then she just flipped her wig ever since that day. So people thought that this showy gentleman, who they weren't even sure what his real name was, had been in this love scam on Miss Havisham and had been aided by another person. Herbert fills Pip in on this, and also he tells him that Estella is not Miss Havisham's issue, that she is adopted. So Pip becomes acquainted with the Pocket family, and he finds them to be honest and hardworking and good people. But Herbert does give Pip a little hint, and he warns that if he ever is to dine with Jagger the Guardian, to look at his housekeeper. Just take a look at his housekeeper. But Pip, he's just self-centered and pretty tunnel visioned on things, and he doesn't pay attention to the housekeeper once he does finally dine with Jagger. Jagger is shown in court and in his dealings with other people, and he's basically shown to be quite fearsome, respected, and he basically just chews up the scenery. Meanwhile, Pip's got it in his head that Miss Havisham is really his benefactor. He starts to not see her as a yellowing skeleton. He starts kind of seeing her as like a fairy godmother figure. And to Pip, Estella is just more beautiful than ever. And even though he has better clothes now and he's a little more educated, he still is made to feel unworthy. But let me show you how manipulative Mrs. Havisham and Estella are to Pip. Then Estella being gone and we two left alone, she turned to me and said in a whisper, "Is she beautiful, graceful, well grown? Do you admire her?" "Everybody must who sees her, Miss Havisham." She drew an arm around my neck and drew my head close down to hers as she sat in a chair. "Love her, love her, love her. How does she use you?" Before I could answer, if I could have answered so difficult a question at all, she repeated, "Love her, love her, love her. If she favors you, love her. If she wounds you, love her. If she tears your heart to pieces and it gets older and stronger, it will tear deeper. Love her, love her." She's just playing with Pip. And later on she says, "I'll tell you," said she in the same hurried, passionate whisper, "what real love is. It is blind devotion, unquestioning self-humiliation, utter submission, trust and belief against yourself and against the whole world, giving up your whole heart and soul to the smiter as I did." So she just really wants Pip to be completely infatuated and obsessed with Estella. As Pip is gone to visit at the Havisham residence from London, he doesn't go back to the forge to say Heidi ho to Mrs. Joe and Mr. Joe and Biddy. He just all of a sudden acts as if their commonness will rub off on him, that it's some kind of communicable disease or something. He's just becoming a little snobby, a little too cool for school, and losing a little bit of the reader's sympathy here. Pip keeps Herbert apprised of the situation with the Havishams from time to time, and Herbert kind of sagely tells him that he doesn't think that Estella's a condition of this benefactorship, this thing with the guardian and Jagger and becoming a gentleman and the money. He just tells Pip how he just abide your time with the guardian and stuff, but I just do not think that Estella is a part of this situation. But Pip really doesn't want to hear that. He wants to kind of believe that Mrs. Havisham's his benefactor and that she's making Pip some grand gentleman so that he'll be worthy of her darling star Estella, and that they're just going to ride off into the sunset and he'll fix up Sada's house and it'll all just be great. And that's what in his mind, the fantasy that's going on, but that has to square up with reality, right? So Estella comes to London and she visits Pip, and she takes it upon herself to inform him that the Havisham relations are all scheming against him and that none of them like him, and so that makes him a little more paranoid about the situation. He even admits to himself that Estella's never made him happy, but he kind of begins to accept kind of like what Miss Havisham had said about like kind of having like a self-sacrificing love, kind of like a love that's always suffering, and he just sort of accepts it at this point. So Pip throws himself headlong into becoming a gentleman. He begins to live the high life. He begins to kind of hobnob with the upper crust. He also takes his best buddy Herbert into the situation because he wants to kind of show Herbert the finer things and let him enjoy that. But what ends up happening is that over time, both he and Herbert become mired in debt. They're up to their eyeballs in debt because he only has so much of a stipend to spend, and he ends up spending over that amount and also getting Herbert into spending money that he doesn't have either. So both Pip and Herbert come to realize that the situation in London is rather joyless and it's not what it's all cracked up to be, hobnobbing with the rich and the just spending money frivolously. But it's too late because by this time they're up to their eyeballs in debt. At this point, Pip receives a letter that Mrs. Joe has finally passed. She's finally died, and so he makes a visit back home for the funeral. So when Pip turns 21, he makes a visit to his guardian, Jagger, and he expects to be told who is his benefactor, and he expects it's going to be Miss Havisham, but he's not told yet. He's given a 500-pound note. He's promised $125 quarterly, which was a good amount of money, but not enough to sustain this gentlemanly lifestyle that he's currently living. But he's not told who his benefactor is. So Pip, at this point, he's getting a little older, and he decides to take that 500-pound note and to try to help Herbert with his income and his debt on the DL, because he believes that his best friend would have never been in this situation had Pip not kind of introduced him to all this and kind of encouraged the debt. He does do one good thing. He's starting his redemption arc as a character by taking that 500-pound note and trying to indirectly help Herbert. So that's redeeming. So at this point, we're given a little window, just a little peephole window into the relationship between Estella and Miss Havisham. And at this point, Estella's becoming a little cold to Mrs. Havisham. Hell, she was raised to be an iceberg, so it's really not a shock. Mrs. Havisham accuses her of being cold, and this is what Estella says. "You should know," said Estella, "I am what you've made me. Take all the praise. Take all the blame. Take all the success. Take all the failure. In short, take me." And she also continues, "Mother by adoption," retorted Estella, never departing from the easy grace of her attitude, never raising her voice as the other did, never yielding either to anger or tenderness. "Mother by adoption, I've said that I owe everything to you. All I possess is freely yours. All that you have given me is at your command to have again. Beyond that, I have nothing. And if you ask me to give you what you never gave me, my gratitude and duty cannot do impossibilities." So I think Miss Havisham is starting to feel that Estella's even pulling away more. I mean, because Estella is planning to marry and she's going to be leaving for good. She's talking about things being forgotten, and Estella says, "No, not forgotten. Not forgotten, but treasured up in my memory. When have you found me false in your teaching? When have you found me unmindful of your lessons? When have you found me giving admission here," she touched her bosom with her hand, "to anything that you've excluded? Be just to me." So proud, moaned Miss Havisham, pushing away the gray hair with both her hands. "Who taught me to be proud?" returned Estella. "Who praised me when I learnt my lesson?" So basically, Estella becomes rather cold to Miss Havisham, and boy, she doesn't like that. She only likes it when Estella is cold and teasing to other people. So in the great climax of the novel, Pip is visited by Magwitch, the convict from the cemetery, and Magwitch tells them that he has been the benefactor all along, and Pip's world is devastated. Magwitch tells him, "I've lived rough so you could live smooth." Magwitch had run off to New South Wales, and Pip is literally stunned. All Pip's great expectations right here in this scene are blown to bits. The fantasy that Mrs. Havisham has been his benefactor all along and that is gussing him up and bettering him up so that he can be a good suitor for Estella, that's blown. The fact that Miss Havisham's his fairy godmother, that's blown. The thought of being at Sada's house, that's blown. The thought of Estella being with him at Mrs. Havisham's request, that's blown. It is all blown to bits. And on top of that, the money that he is getting to be a gentleman and has gotten is come from this dirty convict. All his ideals are blown. And I think he just reacts so violent. He's just revolted. He has repugnance and he's just freaking revolted. And it's so extreme, it's almost like I think he's revolted at himself, because he sees how freaking foolish he has been this whole damn time, and instead of taking it out on himself, this is in my take on it, instead of him taking it out on himself, he takes it out in a way on Magwitch. Like, he just looks at him and he just kind of like just wants to throw up. He has repugnance, he's revolted, he doesn't want to take Magwitch's dirty money, he's just like, yuck, right? He sees all his worthless conduct in chasing Estella. He just sees all the foolishness. And instead of just having a sit down and eating a humongous, entire humble pie, he just decides to just be disgusted by Magwitch. And I have to be honest, I felt really irritated with Pip at this point in the story. Really irritated. Because I looked at it kind of like, you freed that convict, right, Pip? You did it. The convicts come back. Granted, you had ideas about who your benefactor was. Nobody put those ideas in your head. You put those in your own head. The convicts come back and has revealed himself to be your benefactor. And granted, he's not the gentleman you thought, but the guy Magwitch tells Pip that he wants to be essentially kind of like a second father to Pip, and that he hadn't spent any of the money that he's earned in the interim since his freedom, or being free, getting loose, on himself, that he saved it in order to help Pip become a gentleman, that he was just so grateful for Pip's help, and he thought about Pip every day. And it's just kind of like played on my sympathy. I'm not saying continue take his money in the future, but Pip was just so disgusted by Magwitch. I just felt he played his part in freeing helping Magwitch try to escape, so why in the world would you just be so disgusted? Be disgusted with yourself, Pip. But Pip doesn't want to accept Magwitch's dirty money anymore, so he goes and talks to Herbert about the situation. And Herbert Pocket usually has a more level-headed take on everything. I mean, Magwitch has told Pip that he's come back to England under sentence of death. He's risking his life to come back to see Pip. And Pip is just really not grateful. He just wants Magwitch to go away. So he gets with Herbert, and they put their heads together, and they decide to try to get Magwitch out of England in the best way possible without being caught. Meanwhile, Pip does ask Magwitch about that other convict that he'd seen with him. Whenever Pip had given Magwitch the food, the brandy, and the file, at one point when the party went out searching for the convicts and Pip didn't pretend to know anything about them, they were actually captured. And he was captured fighting this other one, and he's told that the other convict's name was Compeyson, that this other Compeyson was just a bad guy. Magwitch tells him that his crime was really truly a misdemeanor, and that Compeyson's crime was a felony, but somehow they were tied together in it, and whenever they went to trial, the Compeyson kind of threw more on Magwitch, and Compeyson was a better liar. In a way, Compeyson had really done Magwitch dirty. He also tells Pip that Compeyson had done really bad things to a rich lady, and smart Herbert starts putting two and two together, and he's like, oh my God, that other guy is the swindler that swindled Mrs. Haversham. Compeyson is that handsome gentleman that swindled Mrs. Haversham. So Herbert's smart. He can put two and two together, whereas Pip just kind of tends to have tunnel vision. Even though he's disgusted, he does feel a little pity, and he decides to hide Magwitch. Herbert decides to also help, and Herbert is kind of got a fiance, and so they decide to hide Magwitch at the fiance's, her father's home. So Magwitch is strongly connected to Pip now, at least in Magwitch's mind, both financially and mentally. Magwitch has survived these years on the lam, fixated on Pip, on raising Pip up, getting Pip money, saving every cent he could have to make Pip a better person. I guess Pip now starts to feel a little bit of guilt about this, but he really just wants Magwitch out of his life. Pip, now that he knows who his real benefactor is, he's got to go back to Miss Haversham and have it out with her about why she led him on, right? Right. This is what you feel when you've gotten halfway through your very long summary and your battery dies and you don't have any idea and you probably talk for 30 minutes.
No.
That's what you feel.
N-O.
So meanwhile, Pip goes to Sada's house to see Miss Havisham, and Estella's there, and he proceeds to tell her that he's aware that she's not his real patron, and he proceeds to also take her to task for using him to bother her greedy relations and using him to also annoy any suitors for Estella. Miss Havisham listens, and she asks Pip what he wants, and he says he doesn't want anything for himself, but he wants to plead the case for the family of Matthew Pocket, Herbert's father and family, that they are actually really good people. They're not like the other Havisham relatives, and that he just says that they're really good people and she should look kindly upon them. Then Pip turns to Estella and tells her that he's in love with her, and she basically tells him that she's going to marry Drummle and that he knew better because she'd warned him numerous times. I'm now going to read to you Pip's impassioned speech to Estella after she flippantly tells him that he will surely just get her out of his thoughts in a week. Out of my thoughts? You're part of my existence, part of myself. You've been in every line I've ever read since I first came here. The rough common boy whose poor heart you wounded even then. You've been in every prospect I've ever seen since. On the river, on the sails of the ships, on the marshes, in the clouds, in the light, in the darkness, in the wind, in the woods, in the sea, in the streets. You've been the embodiment of every graceful fancy that my mind has ever become acquainted with, the stones of which the strongest London buildings are made. You are not more real or more impossible to be displaced by your hands than your presence and influence have been to me, there and everywhere, and will be. Estella, to the last hour of my life you cannot choose but remain part of my character, part of the little good in me, part of the evil. But in this separation I associate you only with the good, and I will faithfully hold you to that always. For you must have done me far more good than harm. Let me feel now what sharp distress I may. Oh, God bless you. God forgive you. So Pip forgives Estella for her ill treatment of him, for teasing him, for tormenting him, and for dragging this along for so many years. And while he gives this speech, he noticed Miss Havisham is watching him, and he says, while Estella looked at me merely with incredulous wonder, the spectral figure of Miss Havisham, her hand still covering her heart, seemed all resolved into a ghastly stare of pity and remorse. His speech has really shaken Miss Havisham, and she realizes that what she's done is really wrong, and she really begins to feel sorry about it. Meanwhile, Magwitch is still being hidden by Herbert Pocket at his girlfriend's father's house, and it comes out that he's recognized. So they have to change plan, and so Pip goes to see Jagger to consult with him about this whole entire situation. And it's this point in the novel where he's at Jagger's house and his housekeeper or maid comes into the room that he realizes what Herbert had been kind of trying to tell him before, how similar the maid, the woman, looks to Estella. And he's stunned, and he sees maybe what Estella will look like when she's older. And so he realized that this is Estella's mother. So Estella's mother is living with Jagger as his housekeeper, and he finds out that Jagger, as the attorney, had represented this woman in a case of murder against another woman over a man, and it turns out that man was Magwitch. So in some kind of weird gothic love triangle, this is kind of folded back in on itself, and it's just extremely odd. And Pip begins to kind of like Magwitch. Miss Havisham asks to see Pip alone. So he goes to Sada's house, and she gives him £900 for Herbert Pocket. She asks Pip for his forgiveness, which he gives freely. He sees that Miss Havisham is in her own prison of curses and memories and regrets, and he takes pity on her, he forgives her. And in a strange turn of events, her old rotting clothes catch on fire from the chimney, and she is immolated. Pip is wounded trying to put out the flames, and in some kind of weird prediction, she ends up laid out on that darn table that she had predicted she would be laid out on, that she had said before that the relatives would come and all see her laid out on the table. Granted, she's burned and she's still alive, but she is laid out on the table in a really eerie twist. Pip is attacked by Orlick. Orlick of the Forge, Orlick of the old days, Orlick who is suspected maybe of hitting his sister over the head with a convict's leg iron. Orlick attacks Pip, ties him up, intends to kill him for dripping poison in old Biddy's ear back in the day when Orlick apparently took a fancy to Biddy. Apparently Orlick has been just biding his time on when he can attack Pip, and he says that Pip has basically been in his way ever since he was a child, and he admits to Pip that he was actually the person who hit Mrs. Joe in the forge with the leg iron. He just so happens to get foiled in his attempt in killing Pip because Pip manages to scream out, and his good friends Herbert Pocket and Startop come to his rescue, and Orlick flees. But Pip and his friends have to get back to the task at hand, which is getting Magwitch out of London, get him out of England because he's still under sentence of execution. Basically, they decide to try to get a boat, a little boat, and to figure out the tide times at the right time to get him off the shore, closer to a barge or something that's going towards Hamburg, going towards Germany, get him off the English coast. And while doing so, it turns out that Magwitch had been tipped off. He'd been seen, and here comes Compeyson and the police, and they try to arrest Magwitch, and Magwitch fights with Compeyson, just like in the first chapter. Magwitch ends up, Compeyson drowns. Magwitch is severely injured in the kerfluffle, and he's taken into custody. During this time, Pip always goes to see Magwitch while he's being held. They're allowed to have visitors, and he really becomes quite fond of Magwitch. He is sympathetic to him, and he almost does finally become like a second father figure to Pip in some weird way. He just caretakes for Magwitch and looks after him and talks to him, and finally Magwitch does die in prison of natural causes, so he doesn't end up having to be executed. But Pip does fall ill. I mean, he has been wounded, and the only thing that keeps his butt out of debtor's prison is the fact he is so darn ill, and he's even not conscious enough to know what's going on, and he is kindly nursed back to health by good old Joe and good old Biddy. They take care of Pip. They get him back healed up. It takes time. Pip gives his approval of their soon-to-be marriage. It's kind of ironic because Pip, it's still at points he's kind of snobby. Like, he just assumed that since now it was blown with Estella, that he could maybe just take Biddy, as his wife. He would confess to Biddy that she was a good woman and ask her to be his wife. Long story short is Biddy and Joe this whole time have become very close. I mean, Mrs. Joe is dead. Biddy had even been around caretaking for Mrs. Joe when Mrs. Joe couldn't talk. So Biddy and Mrs. Joe Mr. Joe become very close, and now they decide to marry, and they have common interests. Pip realizes, oh my gosh, they're going to get married. It's a good thing I didn't send that letter to Biddy, asking her to maybe be my wife, because that would have put Joe in a bad position, and he feels like Joe would have then backed out, and then Pip would have been with Biddy. So it's just like, gosh, you are kind of full of yourself, Pip, because Joe is really a really good guy, and Biddy is a good person, and there's no telling. I don't think Biddy would have picked Pip. I think Biddy would have stayed with good old Joe. I mean, sometimes you got to pick the person that's just really good-hearted. And so anyway, Pip was just so darn glad that he didn't send that letter the day before to Biddy, asking her maybe to be his wife, because then he realized, oh my gosh, they're getting married. Oh gosh, good for them. There's some character development there. And once all healed up, Pip goes to work with Herbert at Herbert's firm. He spends about 11 years learning all the ins and outs. He learns to be a hard worker. He learns to enjoy it. And he even reflects back on the fact that maybe, just maybe, had he never gone to Sada's house, had he never met Miss Havisham and Estella, had he never had that jolting experience, and maybe he would have been happy working at the darn forge. And he kind of learns that what it is, I don't think it's ever spoken directly, but what it is to be a gentleman is to be kind to people, to be hardworking, to be honest, and to be kind of satisfied with your lot in life. And so I guess Pip, in a roundabout way, eventually does become a gentleman. He works hard, he earns an honest wage, and he's content with that. Pip decides to pay a visit 11 years later back at Sada's house just to look around, and he sees that it's pretty much demolished. It's gone. There's a wall remaining, and he's walking around all the old places he remembered. There was a brewery and different places he recalled, the courtyard and things, and he's walking around and he sees a familiar silhouette and he thinks, and it's Estella, just by coincidence. She hasn't been back at the house either. But what she's done is a condition of all of her inheritance or whatever. She had always wanted just the land. She wanted to keep the land, and so she has held on to the land through her bad marriage to Bentley Drummel or whatever, and it was a poor marriage. She has kept the land. So she's walking around the land and she sees Pip, and they have a reunion. Of course, Pip is still the Still the lover, I'm going to read you the final bit of the novel. Estella asks after him, and he says, I work pretty hard for a sufficient living, and therefore, yes, I do well. I have often thought of you, said Estella. Have you? Of late, very often. There was a long, hard time when I kept far from me the remembrance of what I had thrown away when I was quite ignorant of its worth. But since my duty has not been incompatible with the admission of that remembrance, I have given it a place in my heart. You've always held a place in my heart, I answered. And we were silent again until she spoke. A little thought, said Estella, that I should take leave of you in taking leave of this spot. I'm very glad to do so. Glad to part again, Estella? To me, parting is a painful thing. To me, the remembrance of our last parting has been ever mournful and painful. But you said to me, returned Estella very earnestly, God bless you, God forgive you. And if you could say that to me, then you will not hesitate to say that to me now when the suffering has been stronger than all your teaching and has taught me to understand what your heart used to be. I have been bent and broken, but I hope into a better shape. Be as considerate and as good to me as you were, and tell me that we are friends. We are friends, said I, rising and bending over her as we rose from the bench. And we will continue to be friends apart, said Estella. I took her hand in mine, and we went out on the ruined place, and as the morning mists had risen long ago when I first left the forge, so the evening mists were rising now, and in all the broad expanse of tranquil light they showed to me, I saw no shadow of another parting from her. So either that, it means that he doesn't ever think he's going to be parted with her even like as friends or even as lovers, or that he's not going to feel sad about it. I don't know. It leaves you kind of hanging. And they say in the annotations, and I'll go ahead and share with you a little bit about the quote, I saw no shadow of another parting from her. They say there are 3 variations of this final line, this being the most ambiguous version. So that was considered happy. The ambiguity was considered happy. And in All the Year Round, and by the way, All the Year Round was the serial that this was published in, the sentence reads, quote, I saw the shadow of no parting from her but one. Dickens canceled the last 2 operative words in proof, but one. That was taken out. Not surprisingly, over the past century, the 2 general endings to Great Expectations, the original version and the published version, have generated volumes of critical commentary and hours of critical discourse at all levels. Some readers prefer the published ending, the happier of the 2, the more commercial yet more cohesive, with the humanized lovers deserving of their happiness. It seems to fit the plot logically and morally. Others prefer the original ending for its symbolic harmony and its thematic emphasis on the moral lesson that Pip's unselfish use of his good fortune is his only reward. There are countless variations. Take it as you like. I like to think that maybe, I don't think they need to be together, but what does it matter? What does it matter? I hope that you enjoyed this summary of Great Expectations. I hope that it met the smallest amount of your expectations. So I hope you really enjoyed this summary of Great Expectations. And if you did, could you please push that like button and ring that little subscribe bell down here? And that way, anytime I do any classic book reviews, you'll just simply get a notification that I've uploaded a video. And without further ado, it's Friday the 13th, and I hope you have an excellent day. Bye. Peace out.